In the 1930s, a far-right group in Finland captured this man, their former president, and took him and his wife from Helsinki to a remote city nearly 300 miles away. They interrogated them, threatened them, and then released them. This was the Lapua movement, a violent, conservative political movement that almost pushed Finland into authoritarianism. But then, something happened. Somehow, they managed to stave off fascism and have remained a stable democracy ever since. Today, Helsinki is the capital of a nation that stemmed the dangerous political current sweeping the rest of Europe. So how did Finland protect its democracy? And is there something the world can learn from this moment in history? To understand how we got there, let's go back to 1918. The recent rise of communism terrified countries all over Europe, and Finland was no exception. The history really begins with the Finnish Civil War of 1918. There were two sides, the Reds, or the Communists, versus the Whites, the Conservatives. These colors will be important to remember. They clashed in a war with heavy bloodshed. Finland broke away from Red Russia, mercilessly purged its own Reds, and in 1919 finally became an independent nation. And even though the Whites won, many people remained deeply nervous about communism, especially with the new Soviet Union as their direct neighbor. The most radical Whites sought to create a white Finland, an authoritarian state, but that didn't happen. Throughout the 1920s, a simmering resentment against the Republic grew. And that all came to a head in 1929 in, you guessed it, Lapua. Lapua is in South Ostrobothnia, one of the most conservative regions in Finland. So when a communist youth group held a march there, they knew exactly who they were provoking. That was the tinder needed to light the fire. The rally was violently subdued, and the communist youth were thrown out. News of what happened in Lapua spread like wildfire, radicalizing an entire nationalist faction of the Whites. And so, the Lapua movement was born. Within a year, the Lapua movement had populist support across the country. Their supporters weren't just the far right. They included center-right and moderate elites, politicians, and prominent business owners. Many of these moderates thought they could use the Lapua movement, harnessing its passion and popularity, and they were hesitant to push back. There was one more group we need to watch, the Civic Guard. They had two roles: an auxiliary defense force that trained its members in military tactics, and an organization ready in case the Reds rose again. So naturally, they were sympathetic to the Lapua movement's anti-communist cause, but many didn't subscribe to their more authoritarian goals. Keep that in mind for later. By the summer of 1930, the Lapua movement planned a demonstration called the Peasants' March. They had a specific model in mind: Benito Mussolini's March on Rome in 1922, when he used the threat of mass violence to pressure Italy's king into making him prime minister, bringing the fascists to power. You can't dismiss the importance of the March on Rome to the entire European far-right at the time. They organized the Peasants' March on Helsinki, sending tens of thousands of people into a demonstration that some hoped would turn into a coup. But instead, the government met with them and passed laws making communists ineligible for elections and criminalizing communist propaganda. At this point, the Lapua movement was at the height of its power. But at its core, it was a violent and extremist group driven by radical members who acted without restraint. They showed absolute intolerance for anyone who opposed them. Kidnappings became their hallmark. The idea was symbolic. You kidnapped someone you thought was a leftist sympathizer, and they were usually taken by car towards the east, towards the Soviet Union. The message was crystal clear: if you're a communist, you don't belong in Finland. Then, in October of 1930, the radicals of the Lapua movement kidnapped someone who wasn't just an ordinary rival. They kidnapped Tarlo Juho Stalberg, the man you saw at the beginning. Not only was he a former president, he was the first president of Finland's republic. For a lot of people, that went a step too far. It was a provocation that went against the sense of decency of most of their supporters. And that marks the decline of the movement. In the 1931 elections, the Lapua movement made its last real political gain. They helped tip a close presidential election in favor of Per Evan Svinhufvud. Svinhufvud was elected president, and he was the absolute darling of the political right. I even found this photo of him at the Peasants' March, so we know he was involved. But Svinhufvud was also more traditional than the radical whites. In the end, he would back the republic and the rule of law over the dreams of the radicals. So in 1932, even with the president they helped elect in power, the Lapua movement wasn't getting what it wanted. In a final act of desperation, they tried to stage a coup. A group gathered in Mäntsälä near Helsinki, with the goal of rallying the Civic Guard to march on the capital and overthrow the republic. But when they called on the Civic Guard, something they never considered happened. The majority of the Civic Guards did not respond to the call for an uprising. They stayed home and stood down. Then came the nail in the coffin. The Lapua movement's former darling, President Svinhufvud, gave a radio address telling the group to stand down. You could call it the swan song of the Lapua movement. And just like that, the violent extremist group was done. They lost the support of the masses, the politicians, and the military. The Lapua movement was banned, and Finnish democracy has been stable ever since, even surviving the Second World War. Fascism and communism were rejected by democratic Finns. Some details of the Lapua movement have uncomfortable echoes with recent events. Democracy is about the rule of the people, about elections, about popular involvement. But to sustain that, you need unelected officials who manage the guardrails. This highlights the question of who appoints these officials. We often take for granted how many nonpartisan systems are needed for a healthy democracy. But one of the biggest reasons the Lapua movement failed was because it crossed the line. It became too violent and too extreme, too quickly. So it lost mass support, and with it, the elites. But there's one more key lesson from the Lapua movement that is thankfully a lot more hopeful. We remember the fascists of Italy and the Nazis of Germany. But in reality, almost every European country had its own far-right movements, all dreaming of taking state power either through violence or other means. And almost all of them failed. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing for more stories from history.